Fendi, you ready? Okay.
Edward?
Oh, good afternoon. On behalf of CCCW, welcome you all today. Well, thanks for coming, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us this session organized by the Center on Contemporary China and the World, or CCCW, in Hong Kong U. Now, we in the CCCW strive to be a leading voice of reason, a much-needed bridge for fostering mutual understanding, and above all, a prominent constructive force for maintaining peace across Pacific and around the world. So we believe that CCCW would be a platform for the pursuit of the above missions. And we are particularly happy today that we have Ambassador Kishore Mahbubani joining us as our distinguished visiting fellow. And we must also give credit to our founding director, Professor Chang Li, for bringing him in and also building this platform in Hong Kong through CCCW in Hong Kong U. Now, the high turnout today speaks for the appeal of the speakers, Ambassador Mahbubani and also Professor Li, and also the topic, which we call Beyond Winning and Losing, Can Peaceful Coexistence Possible? And also its relevance and timeliness, given all the conflicts and chaos happening around the world, and some might be getting closer to us. Now, Kishore needs no introduction. This is real because, well, Kishore told me that a few days ago when he walked in Central, he bumped into people who come forward because they recognize him and introduce themselves. So Kishore is not a stranger, but a friend in Hong Kong, even at the street level. And I confirm that gentleman knew you and also approached you. But I'll be feeling my duty not to do my job in introducing the speaker. So let me begin with the more obvious chapters. Ambassador Kishore Mahbubani has an exemplary career as a diplomat, not just a patriotic and distinguished diplomat of his country, Singapore, but also an international diplomat serving the wider global community, for instance, through his presidency of the UN Security Council. Now, Kishore is also a distinguished scholar, as demonstrated by his leadership as the founding dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, and also author of 10 books, which are all bestsellers, and with his views widely shared, seriously debated, and well-respected across the spectrum among university, think tanks, and also opinion leaders around the globe. Now, Kishore's views are insightful and often awakening too. In his earlier book, Beyond the Age of Innocence, Rebuilding Trust Between America and the World, published back in 2005 or 2006, right? Which I have the privilege of being given a copy by Kishore personally in that year when he was at Hong Kong. Now, in that book, he presents a paradox that America has done more than any other countries to change the world, and yet Americans are among the least prepared to cope with the world that they have changed, unquote. So almost 20 years after Kishore's remarkable awakening call, are they or are we better prepared? Now, speaking as a friend to both China and the US, Kishore made duly critical comments to the big two. That, on the one hand, he said, China made some strategic mistakes in alienating several major constituencies in America. And US, on the other hand, has also made fundamental mistake by launching a contest against China without first working out a comprehensive strategy. So are they both guilty? Let's discuss. Now, Kishore is also very visionary, especially with his distinctive Asian perspective. He wrote a book titled, Can Asians Think? Now, the answer to which is clearly in the affirmative, and that today, nobody would question the fact that Asians can think. And also, as he pointed out in his new book, not only do Asians think and think big, the whole world actually is now living the Asian century. Now, I think the stature of Kishore is best described by George Yeo, Singapore's former foreign minister, who is also our distinguished fellow who spoke quite recently in CCCW. George wrote in the preface of Kishore's new book that apart from Lee Kuan Yew, no other Singaporeans has achieved a wider reach through his writing and speeches. So you got to give it to Kishore that his articulation and analysis are best sharpened through the titles somehow he picked for many of his books, which are so punchy, to the point, sometimes very blunt and undiplomatic, and yet so revealing. So read this book titles. Can Asians think? Has China won? And has the West lost? Now, these serial titles have in fact prompted the topic that CCCW picked for today, which is the most pertinent question in the world's most important bilateral relations between US and China, i.e., can this not be just winning or losing? Can the war, irrespective in which corner it is to be fought, be avoided? And can peaceful coexistence still be possible? In the dinner conversation on Monday, Kishore asked me to talk a bit about trade in the geopolitical context. Now, let me say this. I, for one, and Hong Kong, too, have been keenly alerted to the imminence of war, which was first emerged and quickly proliferating in the international trade arena since 2018. For that, I do not mean the extensive tariffs US imposed on China alone in that year, but actually months ahead, in that same year of 2018, US invoked the US Trade Expansion Act using national security to impose high tariff on steel and aluminum to all, yes, all of its trading partners, in spite of the obvious contravention of WTO rules. Now, I recall sounding the warning that a war against world trade has been waged, ending the long post-war peace, trusting free trade being a win-win formula for all. Now, that was the reason Hong Kong has in fact taken very swift steps to catch up with free trade agreements since 2018, doubling our agreement and tripling our partners covered by FTA for better security, for we sensed the war was coming. And yet, we are not spared. But are we the only losers? Figures don't lie. While no direct tariff was imposed on Hong Kong, the decade of trade surplus, yes, trade surplus, that the US has earned from Hong Kong has shrunk by 1/4 since the trade war started. So in a way, the US is not spared either. So actually, the whole world is being hit and hurt. A simple set of figures can demonstrate this. The contribution of world trade to global GDP was only 12% back in 1960. With global trade prosper, it raises all the way to the peak of around 60% in 2016 or 2017. It scaled back to 52% at its trough when the trade war was fired. Now, with politics overriding economics and trade being weaponized through the deployment of national security against international recognized trade rules, we are seeing a wartime mentality capturing the center stage of geopolitics today. So the subject today we put forward is a pressing issue that we all need to address, and no doubt it may invoke more questions to come and the worries of collateral damage. What is the chance of competition being turned into conflict with more intensified clashes in multiple fronts, especially when China bashing is now becoming a US consensus among parties? Is the strategy or the lacking of it that Kishore critiques still be missing? If there is no strategy, what is driving this war game between both sides of the Pacific? And whoever wins or loses, what's the toll on the earth, around the world, and particularly its impact on Asia? And can Asians choose? So I used to be in a job that putting myself at the end of answering difficult questions. But today, I'm privileged in CCCW of putting all these questions to the wiser people to be on the stage. So I will join the audience later to pick the greater wisdom, both from Kishore and Chang. So before I pass on the mic, some house rules and procedures. Now, the fireside discussion will be lasting for around 50 minutes, followed by a Q&A session from the audience. And today's session is public and on the record, although we ask you do not record videos unless you have previously granted permission. So ladies and gentlemen, may I ask you now to join me in giving Kishore and Chang a warm welcome. So over to you, gentlemen.
Thank you. Could you hear me? Is that on? No, it's not on. Okay, now. Well, thank you, Edward, for that very thoughtful and inspiring opening remarks. Since I came to Hong Kong U about 13 months ago, I have benefited enormously from you and from other wonderful colleagues, and some of them are also in the audience, for whom I'm deeply grateful. I want to join Edward for welcoming all old and new friends to what promises to be an engaging and enlightening conversation with one of the world's foremost public intellectuals and the diplomatic gurus, Ambassador Kishore Mahbubani. Now, Kishore, we are profoundly honored and privileged to have you to speak to our Hong Kong U audience, and also especially to host you as one of the very first distinguished visiting fellows of CCCW. As you know, our original conversation about this arrangement occurred about 16 months ago at your house in Singapore. I told you that I plan to move from Washington to Hong Kong and to establish this new center. And you so kindly share your willingness to come to Hong Kong U and spend a few weeks with us. My thrilled reaction then was almost like your legendary story 20 years ago about hearing from Hong Kong's richest man, Mr. Lee Kai-shing, about that he would donate 100 million Singapore dollars to your new school within 3 minutes after your request. So, Kishore, I absolutely admire both of your, the very incredible motions. To maximize this conversation, to benefit from your exceptional expertise and insights, I would like to divide this fireside chat into 2 parts. In the first part will cover 4 areas I will have a set of questions for each, namely war and peace, including, or especially about the US-China relations. Number 2, about the rise or re-emergence of Asia and the Asian civilizations. The third is a comparison between Singapore and Hong Kong. And finally, if we have time, your legendary career experience, especially your ongoing adventures in a very troubling world. Now, the second part will consist of 10 yes or no questions, or the short answer questions that require only 1 word or 1 sentence explanation. Now, from the first, I will start with what Edward's introduction implied, and also theme of our conversation today. Beyond winning and losing, is peaceful coexistence possible? Interestingly, ironically, as Edward mentioned, your 2 recent books, one is entitled, Has China Won? The other title, Has the West Lost It? So how would you reconcile these 2 seemingly contradictory narratives between our theme and the title of your books? So in a way, is that possible that you follow the trap of some, kind of warriors in the various parts of the world to try to present this kind of zero-sum game or losing or winning? Or we are too naive and too unrealistic to think beyond the winning and the losing, especially when Europe and the Middle East are deeply engaged in vicious wars? Your answer?
Well, first, let me begin by thanking you and Edward for the very warm welcome. I must say, I must confess to you all, I love coming to Hong Kong. And this time you gave me an extremely hot welcome. I brought my wife along. She said, can we come in November? But anyway, as a Singaporean, I'm used to this warm weather, and especially the warm welcome I'm getting here. But you're asking very, very important questions. I actually was trying to figure out how to use that too. It's very high tech. Anyway, we, as you all know, we live in extremely interesting times. Our world is changing fundamentally in a way that it hasn't changed in centuries. So we have to be psychologically ready for massive changes coming our way. But what makes it in some ways even more difficult to prepare for these changes is the fact that the civilization, and this is in response to your question about where has the West lost it, the civilization that led the world for the last 200 years is losing its way in a very profound way. And I say this because if there was one gift that Western civilization shared with the rest of humanity, it's what I call the gift of rationality. The West said, oh, we believe that in everything you do, you have to base it on evidence. You have to be reasonable and logical in whatever you do. And you must check and verify any information you have, right? In the search for objective truth. And yet, despite all these fundamental maxims of Western civilization, the West is acting irrationally at a time when it should be acting more rationally. And I'll give you 3 concrete examples, huge examples of irrationality. The first example, we know that the world has changed because it's become a small, interdependent world, right? We are hugely connected. And so to use a simple boat analogy, in the past when 8 billion people live in 193 separate countries, they were living on 193 separate boats, right? Separate from each other. So if one boat caught COVID, other boats wouldn't catch COVID. They're separated. But the world has shrunk. The 8 billion of us live in 193 separate cabins on the same boat. So when one cabin catches COVID, all 193 cabins catch COVID. It's so obvious. Now what happens if you are all living on the same boat? What's the most irrational thing you can do? The most irrational thing you can do is when your boat is sinking as a result of climate change, instead of trying to save the boat, you argue about whose cabin is more beautiful. You know, there's an old expression, English expression, there's no point rearranging the deck chairs when the Titanic is going down. That's irrational. But that's what the West is doing. For the United States to launch its geopolitical contests against China when the planet is in peril is hugely irresponsible and hugely irrational. And what's shocking is that the West has the leading universities, the leading think tanks, the leading media channels, and they don't point out that this is irrational behavior. That's just one example. The second example is that what's so obvious is that history has turned a fundamental corner this century. And what was the norm for the past 200 years is not going to be the norm in this century. So, for example, amazingly enough, 100 years ago, in 1924, a few Europeans could run the world effortlessly. 100,000 Englishmen could rule over 300 million Indian ancestors of mine, just like that, effortlessly, right? Europe could run the world. But European power has diminished. One statistic. In the year 1980, the combined EU GDP was 10 times the size of China, 10 times. Now it's the same size as China, and by 2050, Europe will be half that of China. Now, when you have these massive shifts of power happening, surely you should look for rational ways and means of adjusting. Is that happening? It's not. Another sign of irrationality on their part. And the third sign of irrationality is this. If you had to decide what's the most important priority of any society, the most important priority for any society anywhere in the world should be to improve the well-being of its own population, right? If you had to make a choice between X and well-being, you say, no, I must take care of the well-being of your people, of my people. And yet, paradoxically, United States, which is the most rational society on planet Earth, at a time when the average standard of living of the bottom 50% of the American population has stagnated for 3 decades, and the priority should be to take care of the bottom 50%, instead of focusing on people, the United States says primacy is more important than people. Any country that chooses primacy over the well-being of its own people is making an irrational decision, and nobody questions it.
Well, Kishore, you provide a very important the foundations for your thesis. We will go back to the problem of the West, or what you call the irrationality later on, what went wrong. But here I have 2 more urgent questions. One is some strategic thinkers in various corners of the world assert the real battlefield of World War III will be in Asia. East Asia and along with Southeast Asia are rapidly becoming what some people call powder keg, 火药桶 in Chinese. Now, how do you envision, actually you also in another occasion, a few months ago, you said that we are going to witness the largest geopolitical contest for many, many years. You also said just moments ago. How bad could it be? And is military conflict inevitable? What's the best way to avoid it? This is the first part. The second part, is it possible that a conflict between China and the United States could end up with a winner and a loser, especially at the time of AI, that given China and the United States are the 2 largest AI powers? Can policymakers in Washington and Beijing really envision this kind of a result? Are they really dumb, could not see the danger? What's your take about this?
Well, I mean, that's exactly why I wrote my book, Has China Won? Because there's absolutely no question. Of course, there's a wonderful Arab proverb which says, he who speaks about the future lies, even when he tells the truth. We will get surprises, right? No question. But in one area, there'll be absolutely no surprise. There is no question whatsoever that the US-China geopolitical contest will accelerate over the next 10 years because there's a rock-solid consensus in Washington, D.C. that the United States has about 10 years to try and stop China from becoming number one, because there's a fairly reasonable calculation that if the Chinese economy continues to grow, and if it becomes number one, then the world changes. So in some ways, you could argue it's rational on their part to try and stop China, although I would also argue that the means they're using are irrational. So the contest will definitely accelerate. But you also ask, will it lead to war? And here, on balance, I'm reasonably optimistic that there will be no all-out war, because in an all-out war between two nuclear powers, there is no winner and a loser. There's a loser and a loser. Mm-hmm. And you notice that the Biden administration started its first 2 years taking a very hard line on China because they wanted to show that they were as macho as the Trump administration. But I think when things got really difficult, then they said, oh, maybe we should pause and try to find a way of at least keeping a certain degree of balance. And that's why, as you know, Jake Sullivan just recently came to Beijing. So there will be an effort on both sides to try and avoid an outright war. But of course, the one lesson of history is that mistakes do happen. And that's what we need to worry about. Now, in terms of what we in East Asia can do about it, I think it's important for East Asia to keep up its culture of pragmatism that we have developed. One of the most unusual things that's happened in our region is that at the end of World War II, virtually all the major wars were fought here in East Asia. The Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Sino-Vietnamese War. But after the Sino-Vietnamese War of 1979, right, for the past 45 years,
no major wars.
There's been no major war. This did not happen by accident. This happened as a result of decisions made by countries and leaders here who understood that the priority is to focus on economic development and not get engaged in wars. So therefore what we in East, but I can tell you, if you look at my book, Can Asians Think, I quote several Western scholars who said at the end of the Cold War, Asia's future is Europe's past. So in the past, Europe fought all the big wars, World War I, World War II. Oh, that's Asia's future. Paradoxically, the opposite has happened. The major wars have happened on the fringes of Europe and not in Asia. And no European asked the most basic question, why have we Europeans not learned to be as peaceful as the Asians?
So it's a fear or the conflict of interest or the concern about the U.S. losing its hegemonic power is the driver. It's the deep-rooted reason about the deterioration of US-China relations, right? Is that your argument?
I think that's what our
not ideology.
That's what our friend Graham Allison, as you know, keeps saying. And you know, he wrote a book called Destined for War, in which he documents that throughout history, the number one power never gives up its position gracefully, right? It doesn't happen.
But you probably will not agree that the ultimate result is a hegemonic war. This should be and must be.
Yeah, well, I think that's what I agree with the analysis that Graham Allison provides on all the case studies. But when he says in his book that war is more likely than not between the United States and China, I don't agree with him. And to be fair to him, he has modified that position also himself. Graham.
Yeah. You mentioned about Jack Solomon's trip to Beijing this week. As I understand, the main purpose is to try to prepare a summit, either on the sideline of the upcoming annual ASEAN meeting in Laos this October, or if that cannot work, could be the G20 meeting in Brazil in late November after election. Now, do you have any expectation? But more importantly, how would you evaluate kind of achievements, or probably more likely the failure of the Biden administration's approach to China? Your assessment?
Well, I think for a start, by the way, the sad part is that I think when Joe Biden writes his memoirs, one sentence I don't think he'll be happy writing is that I understand he's the first US president since Jimmy Carter not to have visited China. I mean, to be fair, it was partly because of COVID. In 2021, 22, he couldn't visit China because of COVID. But even since then, it's such a tragedy that he's not been able to go. And I can understand, by the way, as a diplomat for 33 years, the fact that Joe Biden still wants to meet Xi Jinping is a very good thing. Every time leaders meet and talk face to face, we should encourage it. In fact, it should happen every day without any question, without any hesitation. But unfortunately, domestic politics in the United States made life impossible for Biden because he couldn't afford to be seen to be soft on China. If you're seen to be soft on China, you lose elections in the United States. And so I think his challenge now is that if he sees Xi Jinping before the November 6th election, Trump will immediately say, you see, the Democrats are soft on China. Yeah. So he's got to wait till after November 6th. But then if, for example, if Trump wins and Biden meets Xi Jinping, everybody will say, what's the point? It's a lame duck meeting, right? Even though in theory it's always good for leaders to meet. So I think the Biden administration is caught in a really impossible position because if he tries to meet Xi before the elections, he may undermine Kamala. And if he meets Xi after the election, then people will say, what's the point?
Two follow-up questions. One is that, do you really see there's a possibility that Biden will visit China? You said that this is the only president did not visit China. And I'm talking about
I would actually encourage him to do so.
To do so, okay.
Of course. I
but
mean,
of course, the media,
at the end of the day, I can tell you this. The one good thing about going to China is that the one country that knows how to lay out the red carpet and make you feel really, really important is China.
Yeah. A question about the incoming administration, whether Harris or Trump. In what area you would suggest they make some breakthrough regarding China? Or you think it's really fantasy to do that under the current political environment, as you assume that you early on mentioned about 10 years, they will be highly problematic. Do you have any suggestion?
Well, I think there's no question that no American leader can be seen to be soft on China today. But by the way, unless you're exceptionally brave, my sense is that, again, this is a paradox about the United States. Traditionally, it's the educated establishment that should be more rational and calm, and the people at large may be subject to populist moods. But in the United States, paradoxically, I'm told that if you do the surveys of the population, the people don't share the same degree of anti-China animus that you find in the establishment. But the establishment in Washington, D.C. has locked itself into an anti-China posture. And today, it's impossible possible for any politician to say anything, just something rational on China, like something as simple. Now, this is the ABC of international trade, Edward, right? When you and I trade, both of us benefit. That's why we trade, right? If I want to lose money, why do I trade with you?
Let me change.
You make money, I make money, we should trade. But the paradox is that even though trade, right, is a rational activity within two countries, anybody who supports trade with China is dead politically. Now, which is bizarre.
Yeah.
Right?
I certainly share with your sentiment. Now, change to the other side, China. You have met many Chinese top leaders. I remember that you and I both in the meetings with top leaders, including Xi Jinping and including Li Keqiang. I remember you asked a question, and I don't know whether you were in the meeting with Li Qiang or not last year. Okay, I was at the meeting, but several meetings. Now, in case that you will meet top Chinese leaders in the next meeting, Chinese leader ask you what China can improve its relations with the United States, with the EU, especially with ASEAN countries. The relation is not bad, but it could be even better. What's your suggestions for these three areas?
Well, I think in the case of China, I would say that China's got to calculate whether or not time is on China's side or not on China's side. If China's growth has peaked, right, as many Western scholars believe, and they may be right, you never know, you'll find out 10 years from now, then I would say it's a problem for China, right? If your power has peaked, then your influence will diminish over the next 5 to 10 years, and maybe you want to try and achieve as much as you can. But if you don't believe that China has peaked, and you believe that China can grow at even 4 to 5% over the next 10 to 15 years, then China will eventually become the number one. So if time is on your side, you can be even more patient, even more restrained. So even though others, may be making stupid, nasty statements. I mean, I give you an example. For the NATO Secretary General, Jens Stoltenberg, to talk about expanding NATO in Asia is absurd. What can we Asians learn from NATO, which has failed to achieve peace, right? So NATO means North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Somebody should give Jens Stoltenberg a lesson in geography. This is Pacific Ocean, not Atlantic Ocean, right? He doesn't know that. I'm serious. Jens Stoltenberg will go down as one of the stupidest men in history.
Yeah.
Right? So, but when he makes those kinds of provocative statements, you can either react strongly or you can ignore it. You can just say, this is just stupid.
What?
And so what I would say in the case of China, I would say to continue to show patience and fob off all these insults that are coming your way. Because if time is on your side, you can say, why don't we talk 10 years from now?
Yeah, it's a brilliant advice. I think that at the both strategic and philosophical level, you answered the question in all these three cases. Now, let's shift to civilizations or rise of re-emergence of Asia or Asian civilizations. Over 60 years ago, the famous English historian Arnold Toynbee, that guy, right, visited Asia and spoke about the evolution of civilizations, their rise, decline, victory, and defeat. He wrote, I quote, "Dynamic shift of history can turn Asian civilization into the world's roundabouts." 历史的变迁可以使古老的文明成为世界回旋处。Sorry that I said translate into Chinese because it's a beautiful line by the historian. Now, in the past few decades, a great man from Singapore, the man who is with us here who held as Asia's town meeting. This is not it's a big achievement, I would say. And in my view, there are probably only a half dozen people who have been so instrumental in forecasting and conceptualizing the revival and the growing global influence of Asian civilizations in our time. Now, you are undoubtedly one of them. Asia's historical rise or reemergence can be seen in two major ways. You already mentioned one is on the regional peace. 40 years peace is not a small achievement. Secondly, on economic growth. Just give you one example that both of you and I work on the middle class. Out of 5 largest middle class countries in today's world, 4 are in Asia: China, India, Japan, Indonesia. The other one is the United States. So these are really tell you so much about the power and the influence of Asia in our era. Now, also, for the first part and the security things, this year marks the 70th anniversary of the declaration of the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, our subtitle. Here are my questions. What lessons and wisdom can Asia, especially ASEAN, offer to the world? So you already mentioned that. Could you be more specific tell about this development? Now, also that in what ways what you call the Asian civilization differ from Western civilization, especially its relevance in today's world? Kishore?
Okay, first on the rise of Asia, Edward mentioned several of my books, but this is my latest book, Living the Asian Century. But just before this book, I published a free book, an e-book, with a German publisher called Springer Nature.
3 million hits.
No, yeah, exactly. What I was going to say is that the publisher
3 million downloads.
told me that the target number of downloads for that free open access book should be 20,000. 20,000 downloads is a success. Now, instead of 20,000 downloads, there have been 3.6 million downloads in 160 countries. Now, this is not a commercial because it's a free book. I'm not making money from this. But it's an indicator to you that the world is psychologically preparing for the Asian century. Everybody can see that the Asian century is coming. But the West, of course, is in denial about it. And you know, if any American politician dares to say, oh, this is not going to be the American century, this is going to be an Asian century, he's dead. So this is an example of what I mean about, you know, if you believe that you should base your statements on data, on evidence, data and evidence says Asian century. But you cannot say it. Amazing. It's the truth. But you cannot speak it. You mentioned middle class statistics. The statistic that I use is for what I call the CIA countries. CIA is not Central Intelligence Agency. CIA is China, 1.4 billion people, India, 1.4 billion people, ASEAN, 700 million people. Total population, 3.5 billion, almost 40% of the world's population. Now, in the CIA countries, out of 3.5 billion people in the year 2000, only 150 million had middle-class living standards. But by 2020, in 20 years, that number exploded from 150 million to 1.5 billion, an increase of 10 times in 20 years. This is an example of what I mean, that is unprecedented change in human history. And by 2030, that number could hit 2.5 to 3 billion. Can you imagine that? We've gone from 150 million in the year 2000 to close to 3 billion by 2030. That's an amazing shift, right? And that's why you should say, is the Asian century. Now, your second question is, what are the lessons to learn from Asia? And here, the paradox about Asians is that, on the one hand, when it comes to managing societies, in one way or another, the Asian societies are showing greater competence, especially in terms of delivering economic growth. Let me give you another shocking statistic. You know, ASEAN, of course, got 700 million people, but the GNP of ASEAN is so much smaller than the GNP of the European Union, right? ASEAN is about 3.5 trillion, and EU is about 16, 17 trillion, 5 times bigger. Guess what? In the decade 2010 to 2020, ASEAN, with 1/5 of the GNP of EU, delivered more global economic growth than the European Union did. So there's a high degree of competence in this region, but they don't speak about it. They don't make a big show of it. But at the end of the day, clearly within Asian societies, we are developing a kind of learning culture, a willingness to learn, a willingness to share, and a willingness to cooperate.
Well,
and all this is done very quietly without any big show. So if you look around the world, I mean, seriously, go to Latin America, go to Africa, go to South Asia, go to Europe, go to Central Asia. You will not see this kind of growth. So something special is happening here, and we should be aware of it.
Kishore, for the sake of debate, I want to ask you, you actually know better than anyone else that Asia, even East or Southeast Asia, is diverse lot. Dr. Henry Kissinger, our mutual friend, is famously credited with the quote, "Who do I call if I want to call Europe?" So by the same token, I may ask, what number do I use if I want to call Asia? Now, the essence of this question is, do we overstate the case of Asia as unified entity? Now, early on, you mentioned your cynicism of a so-called the Asia version of NATO. But China is deeply concerned about that threat. And also that even Indian and China relations is also a big question. Could you comment on that lack of unified entity, the other way to look at this issue?
Yeah, a very good question, and I'm happy to inform you that I answer it in this book.
So of course, buy that book.
But a short answer. There is no question that there is a lot of diversity in Asia. I mean, frankly, Indian civilization is very different from Chinese civilization. And frankly, I mean, we might talk about this at some point. If there's one thing that worries me, it's about the relations between China and India. I think it's going to be quite difficult in the coming decade, and we should speak about that too. But when people say that there are no connections in Asia, they don't understand the past 2,000 years of history. And I point out the deeper connections by just using my personal example. Now, I was born as a Hindu Sindhi in Singapore, okay? Now, Hinduism, right, connects me with 1 billion people in India. And you know what? 9 out of the 10 Southeast Asian countries have an Indic base. Even Philippines, a Catholic country, when they hosted the East Asian Summit, the leader had to put on a show. They put on an Indian cultural show, Ramayana. Amazing, right? So that's Hindu, there's an Indic connection, India, Southeast Asia. Now I'm a Hindu. My name, Mahbubani, comes from an Arabic Persian word, Mahbub, which means beloved. And the script I learned to write as a child, as a Hindu, was not the Hindi script, but the Arabic script. Here and I, as a Hindu, have links with the Arabic world. The script I learned was Arabic. And then, as a child, my mother used to take, as a Hindu, take me to Buddhist temples. She said Hinduism and Buddhism are very close. So when I travel in China, when I go to Korea, when I go to Japan, and I visit Buddhist temples, I feel a connection. So there are all these deeper layers of cultural connection among the Asian societies, which frankly were in many ways suppressed by 200 years of Western colonial rule. But all the disruptions of Western colonial rule will gradually disappear, and the old connections will appear. So there are longer historical connectivities within Asia that we should also be aware of, despite the fact that Asia is so diverse and so different in many ways too.
Great. They actually learned a great deal, particularly from your early childhood, the way your mother played such an important role for your personal growth. It's very, very moving. Now, let me move to a comparison of Singapore and Hong Kong before my 10 short questions. Now, as a prominent leader in a small country who has a global influence, certainly your experience is remarkable. In your books and lectures, you have often talked about big lessons for small countries. One important strategy for small countries is to position themselves in a way to avoid taking a position on major power rivalry, just as expressed in Lee Kuan Yew's famous quote, when two elephants fight, glass suffers. But when two elephants make a laugh, the glass also suffers. Now, do you think such a view is still valid today? Is it best for nations like Singapore, when China and US, or China and Russia, and by the way, the Russian Consul General is also in the audience, are friendly and less confrontational, but are not friends or allies? Your view for ASEAN countries or small countries?
Well, I think, unfortunately, geopolitics is one of the coldest, cruelest businesses in the world. And if any small country has any illusions that great powers will sacrifice their own interests to help small countries, that never happens. There is no such thing as a benevolent great power. The term benevolent great power is an oxymoron. If you're a great power, you're not benevolent. You take care of your interests first. And that's been true for 2,000 years, So therefore, it's very important for small states to be prudent. But having said that, we should also realize that the best time in history to be a small state is now. Because one of the biggest gifts that the United States and the Western powers made at the end of World War II was to draft the United Nations Charter. And the United Nations Charter created new principles for international behavior. Before the UN Charter, it was more or less legitimate for big powers to take over small countries if they decided to do so. I mean, even the United States would do that, as you know, when it declared war against Spain and conquered Philippines. That was the old norms. But now, post-UN Charter, most small states are not being invaded. So we should try to preserve the UN Charter and the principles of the UN Charter, and also, by the way, the 5 principles of Panchasila that you mentioned. Next year, incidentally, we're going to celebrate the 1955, 70th anniversary
70s.
of the Bandung Conference. And I hope that Indonesia will organize a Big Bang Bandung Conference to reiterate the principles of Pancasila, because they're very, very important for small states.
Sure.
And that's why I think I'm in that sense more optimistic for the future of small states.
That's great. Now, Singapore is a city-state, and Hong Kong is not. Hong Kong is part of China under one country, two system framework. In 2015, you wrote a book titled Can Singapore Survive? So almost 10 years have passed. Singapore is doing great. Now it's not in a survival mood, but in a triumphant mood, right? I probably characterize it accurately. Now, but I want to ask a similar question regarding another city. Can Hong Kong survive? How can it survive? Quote unquote, survive. What are the key lessons that Hong Kong can learn from Singapore? Do Singapore and Hong Kong conflict each other? These are the questions that I wanted to ask. Maybe I add one more. We in Singapore and Hong Kong commonly believe that the small cities can make big impact. How can we find new leverage for Hong Kong to make a big impact in today's geopolitical landscape?
Well, I
Several
must say
questions.
that's a very difficult question. Because I think Hong Kong has got to be very, very careful. And so does Singapore too, by the way. As the US-China contest gains momentum, countries, cities will be pushed to take sides. And in the case of Hong Kong, it's no choice, because Hong Kong is part of China.
Yeah.
And you have to, respect Chinese interests, clearly. But at the same time, I would say that there are lots of opportunities still for Hong Kong in the small interdependent world that we live in. And it's important for the policy makers of Hong Kong to be ambitious and bold and seize any opportunities that may arise. I'll give you an example. There is still, among 8 billion people in the world, a lot of talented people who in the past would naturally gravitate towards the West, towards United States, to Europe, to Australia, Canada. But in all these countries, certainly in Europe, there's a populist backlash against immigration. Even in the United States, amazingly enough, a country that has thrived on immigration. Frankly, that's the biggest competitive advantage that the US has. But as doors to global talent close around the world, Hong Kong can open the doors to global talent. And you have an advantage, right? You have political stability. You can plan for the long term. And there's a Nobel Prize winner, Paul Romer, who spoke about creating new charter cities for the globally talented. Hong Kong can become a new charter city for the globally talented.
That's wonderful. There are several senior government.
And one of the examples of global talent is Cheng Li.
No.
A round of applause for Cheng Li.
Yeah, very kind. There are several senior officials in the audience from Hong Kong government. I know that you also will see top leaders of Hong Kong. I think that we all will benefit from your insight. I will skip the last major area about your personal journey, because your memoir, it's really fascinating reading. Sorry, a lot of notes, a lot of preparation. And I particularly like the subtitle, Undiplomatic Memoir. This is a
diplomatic memoir.
Has anyone used that title before?
I'm sure.
Undiplomatic
I'm
memoir?
sure somebody is used.
Okay, but it's fascinating because this is a talk. It's not about a book talk, because Asian Society and also our CCCW also will participate. I think September 5th, they will host you for book talk. Right?
Yeah.
And, so please do attend the Asia Side meeting. Let me go back to the quick questions that I want to ask you. 10 quick questions before start the audience questions. I hope they can find the stage. Sorry. Several versions, a lot of pages. And by the way, do you have any question for me? No, of course.
Well, I think, I mean, the question I have for Cheng Li is that, you know, he's lived many years of his life in Washington, D.C. And Washington, D.C., I spent 2.5 years of my life. It's a fascinating place to be in. You know, it's still the Rome it was the Rome of the 20th century. Let's see whether it remains the Rome of the 21st century. But it's a city that has got a lot of magnetism and dynamism of its own. And I'm sure you learn lots of things. So one day, I would encourage you all to invite Cheng Li to come back here and talk about his years in Washington, D.C., and the lessons he learned.
Thank you. The 17 years, certainly I learned.
And then I will chair the talk when he speaks.
Okay. Now here are the 10 questions very quickly. Require only one word answer, or yes or no, or one sentence explanation. Number one, who will likely win the 2024 election?
I can choose one only, right?
Yeah.
Donald Trump.
Are you worried that on November 5th, the United States may not have a new president because the defeated party will not concede? And this has actually already happened last time, right? But this time could be even much more prolonged and more difficult. Do you see this kind of scenario?
Yes. Actually, it's happened twice.
Yes,
it happened also
2000.
In the year 2000. And I can tell you one of our mutual friends, some of you may know him, Daniel Fang was staying in my house in New York. We went to bed at 11 p.m. We were convinced that Al Gore was the president. We woke up next morning and we discovered that there was no new president. We discovered after 2 months. So this has happened twice in the history of the
the first time the atmosphere is very, very different, right? Because there's not so kind of vicious bipartisan politics. American society is not divided, was not divided as now, right? Number three, which war, Ukraine war or Gaza war, will likely end earlier? Is a ceasefire possible between Russia and Ukraine in the next couple of years?
First question, Gaza. Second question, in a few years, yes. In a few months, no.
Okay, good. Well, I was surprised. Gaza crisis will be resolved earlier than Ukraine. If there's a military conflict or even war between China and the United States in the coming years, where it will occur most likely? The Taiwan Strait, the South China Sea, the Korean Peninsula, or China-Indian border?
Taiwan Straits.
Interesting. I would say probably South China Sea. And if geopolitical tension between the United States and China reach a point where Singapore must choose a side, which side do you think Singapore will most likely to choose? United States or China?
That's a very easy question.
Sure.
Neither side.
Next one. If China's GDP exceeds that of the United States, and also none of the US-led decoupling or relocation policies work well, say in next 10 years, do you think Washington policymakers will change their China policy?
No.
Still not.
I mean, you said one word, right?
You have one sentence to explain.
No, I think it's a given that the US-China contest will definitely accelerate.
Even China surpass United States in terms of...
Yeah, I think don't forget that you must never, ever underestimate the United States of America. It's a truly formidable power. And even after China's GNP becomes number one, the US dollar will remain the global reserve currency for at least 2 or 3 decades after that.
One sentence.
And so I would say that the US, even after the Chinese GNP surpasses, the US will keep up its struggle.
You and I have talked a lot about US-China relation, talk about US, especially talk about US and China. It might give the audience the wrong impression in terms of the notion of G2. So do you see today's world in a bipolar structure or multipolar structure or something else?
Multipolar.
Thank you. What's the percentage chance that India will replace UK as a permanent member of the UN Security Council in the next 2 decades? You served twice or once as the chairman or president of the UN Security Council. Yeah. So you wrote about that.
Well, I wrote a column in the Financial Times.
Yes, I know that. I know that. Give us
the answer to the question, what are the prospects of India replacing UK as a permanent member of UN Security Council in the next 2 decades? The answer is 100%.
100%. Oh, okay. In 20 years. Over a year ago, I had the honor, and actually less than a year ago, I had the honor and the privilege to have a fireside chat with your friend and the former Singapore Foreign Minister, George Yeo, here in this room. I asked him that in light of many crises and rampant corruption before Xi Jinping's administration, especially like the Bo Xilai, Zhou Yongkang crisis, did Xi Jinping save the Chinese Communist Party? This is the question I asked him. He said no. He said Xi Jinping saved China. Do you agree?
Well,
here's a question.
Since I can only say yes or no, I think I'll say yes. I would qualify it somewhat, but never mind.
You can qualify it somewhat if you want.
No, I think the story is, as you know, complicated. China has gone through serious internal challenges before Xi Jinping took over power. And actually, I document this in my book, Has China Won? Because 2 political monsters emerged in China. One was corruption, and the other was factionalism. Yeah. So Xi Jinping had to destroy 2 political monsters, and that's not easy, by the way. Killing such large political monsters takes an extraordinary amount of skill.
That's fair
so
enough.
Anybody who succeeds in it, you got to give credit to them.
Well, number 10. Actually, I have 11 questions. Originally, I want to drop one, but since you haven't answered, so let me finish this too. Number 10. With the ongoing debate over the negative impact of technology, especially AI, on jobs and societies, are you optimistic or pessimistic about this arguably unprecedented technological revolution? Optimistic or pessimistic?
Optimistic.
That's great. Final question. You are the founding dean of Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore in 2004, exactly 20 years ago. My colleagues and I at Hong Kong U just established this CCCW a few months ago. What should be the top priority for CCCW now? Here are the possible things. Building a policy platform, playing a bridge role across the region and the world, contributing original research, bringing strong money, strong funding, like you did so well in the beginning, forming a dedicated and talented team. I believe that actually we'll probably already achieve that in that regard, with talented scholars like Brian Wang and many, many others. Following the visionary leadership from the university, taking a more balanced or more provocative approach, or hosting big-name associates like you. Of course, that we wish to have them all, but what should be the strategic priority?
Playing a bridging role.
Bridging role.
Because I can tell you that unfortunately, and this you can quantify, okay? At the level of human being to human being contacts between United States and China, there were hundreds of delegations from China going to United States, hundreds of delegations from United States going to China. Now that is down to a trickle. This is evidence-based. So somebody's got to step in and play a role of building a bridge. I think you can do it.
We are going to have an ASEAN conference in October. Would you like to come here again?
Anytime.
Okay. With that, thank you so much. Now, I'm sorry for 10 minutes more longer, so we're open for questions. Please identify yourself. Only one question, and not a lecture, just one question. So let's start with that gentleman. Yes. Yeah. You.
David Pong, Shewing Steel. For those of us who follow your numerous YouTubes on your speeches and interviews, you will appreciate your humor, amazed at your mastery of all kinds of statistics, and your very acute analysis of geopolitical situations. And that is why I call you the rock star of modern geopolitics.
Thank you.
You mentioned Trump. My opinion is, had Trump had his second term then, he would have doubled down on the liaison with Russia, North Korea, and India. Would he have totally isolated China? But in today's situation, it's the reverse. And so I look at what a seasoned politician, Brzezinski, wrote in his book, The Grand Chessboard, that you know. The most dangerous coalition would be China, India, China, Russia, and possibly Iran, who get together not because of shared ideology, but for common grievances.
Yes.
What would your opinions on those?
I add one thing for that excellent question. Do you think Putin will trust the United States?
Those are very, very difficult questions. Now, I think the first point I want to make is that China, Russia, Iran are very strong, powerful, traditional states. They have their own history, their own experiences, their own memories, right? And the interests of these three are not naturally aligned at all. However, if the three of them are feeling pressure from the West, as they are, then there will be a temporary alliance. But if you look at my book, Has China Won? I explain at some length why even the China-Russia alliance is not natural. It's being driven by coalition of forces that are happening. And so I would say that you should be prepared for a lot of fluidity in the global system. Because I do believe at some point in time, Europe has got to come to terms with its neighbor, Russia. It's going to live with Russia for the next 1,000 years. It cannot alienate Russia for the next 1,000 years. It's got to find a way of compromising. And at some point in time, there will be compromises and there won't be these hard divisions that you see in the world today.
Yeah.
Your question about Putin, you know, trust is overrated in international relations. As Reagan said, you know, you trust but you verify. At the end of the day, what enables countries to cooperate is never trust, but coincidence of national interests. If it's in my interest to cooperate with you, then I'll cooperate with you. So even if I like you, if my interests don't converge, I say, thank you very much, we're not cooperating.
Well, I assume that you believe that the United States will, in a difficult situation for the many years to come, largely for domestic problems. So the leaders may not have the real power to carry out some of major policy move. So that certainly explains my question that I think a Russian leader will be very hesitant, very suspicious, right? Particularly strong anti-US sentiment. Brian?
Thank you very much, Prof. Kishore. It's lovely to see you here. My question's about the CIA countries. Essentially, we see between China and India tensions revolving around the LAC, Arunachal Pradesh, you know, tensions over TikTok and a banning of apps and protectionism from Delhi, but also a deep suspicion of India's intentions coming from Beijing. On the other hand, when it comes to ASEAN, of course, the South China Sea right now is a powder keg with Bongbong Marcos in the Philippines, in many ways lashing out and also acting out on behalf of what he sees to be grievances in ASEAN towards China over Navy patrols and also China's claims over territories there. How exactly can Beijing, if you were to sit down with Wang Yi or Xi Jinping, you know, what advice would you give to them on resolving the tensions and also ameliorating the difficulties in relation to both ASEAN countries and also India? And are you optimistic about the prognosis in the relationships between the three parties? Thank you very much.
This is Assistant Professor of Philosophy at Hong Kong U and also CCCW member, fellow.
Well, I think I must confess to you, I do worry a lot about the relationship between China and India, because relations between China and India, they're not bad. They're very bad. And you describe it with the actions that have been taken. But at the end of the day, I also believe that both sides are rational actors. And in the case of India, the goal of India is to emerge effectively as the third most powerful pole in a multipolar world. And the best way for India to emerge is to cooperate with as many countries as possible. And now you can see more and more articles coming out in the Indian media saying that if India is to succeed in becoming a manufacturing power, it cannot cut off Chinese imports. It's got to get Chinese input. If you want to manufacture anything, let's say EVs, batteries, if you don't get Chinese components, you cannot succeed. So there is some degree of new thinking going on in India. So I would say there's a possibility of relations between India and China improving. In the case of the Philippines, you know, Philippines is a fellow ASEAN member state. The one piece of advice I would give to Philippines is that dealing with China requires a policy that you can continue not for the next 10 years, not for the next 100 years, but for the next 1,000 years. So you've got to work out a consistency in your policy. Now, sadly, in the case of Philippines, when you had President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, pro-China, President Aquino, pro-US, President Duterte, pro-China, and then President Marcos today, clearly closer to US. And that kind of inconsistency is very dangerous for any mid-sized state. So Philippines should learn from Vietnam how you work out a policy that enables you to get along with China and to stand up to China. You must be able to do both. But you must be consistent and predictable.
Yeah.
Very, very important.
Well, thank you so much for really answering the question in so comprehensive way. Earlier that I have a question about what's the most dangerous spot. You mentioned about Taiwan Strait. Of course, no question that Taiwan is the most important issue for China, the core interest for China. But let me just share with you my observation. I frequently visit China and also talk to my colleagues back in Washington. It seems to me there's a growing number of scholars in both places believe that the South China Sea become even more dangerous for various reasons, and because China probably will be more hesitant to touch about the Taiwan issue in the cross-strait relations. So just want to share with you. Of course, we do not know the answer. It's just some assessment. More questions? And that young lady, yeah.
Thank you first for the inspirational
Introduce
talk.
yourself.
My name is Stacy. I'm a history undergrad student here at
Very good.
CUHK. Not here, but CUHK. Close enough, close enough. I've been reading your book, Has China Won? And in it you wrote about whether China, you had a chapter on whether if China was expansionist. And sort of came to a conclusion that though with its increased presence, it will not entirely depend on aggressive military policies. And there are Chinese scholars who also argued that this increase in assertiveness is a result of aggressive US foreign policy and, of course, domestic leadership change. With the election, with complications in the South China Sea and Taiwan and everything, I have two questions. Do you still...
Just one.
Oh, okay. Do you still agree with what you wrote in that book about China's assertiveness? Yes.
Yeah, I really should not let Brian to put two questions in one question format. Can we wait to pick up a few more questions? Yeah, please. Yeah, this gentleman.
My name is Yi, and I'm a tech founder. So I started companies in China, Singapore, as well as in the US. So my question is, you mentioned in your talk that China, when Xi Jinping took over the power, had two challenges with the corruption as well as the factionism. So my question is like, how can you maintain kind of a democratic, a healthy level of democracy within a one-party system if you eliminate the factionism entirely? Or is there any other ways to, in your opinion, to kind of build up a correction mechanism within the governance system if you eliminate the factionism?
Okay, my colleague Daniel Bill, professor. Yeah,
Thank you.
No.
If let's assume that India becomes a major world power, perhaps surpasses China in 3 decades' time, will it be the US's #1 enemy? And perhaps that'll be good for China.
Ambassador Cui Tiankai recently said he wished that India surpassed China, sooner. Cui Tiankai wished that India surpassed China sooner than. So very much in line with. The last question I want to reserve for media because there are a lot of media outlets here. Okay, the gentleman, yeah. Identify yourself.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Mahbubani. I'm a reporter from South China Morning Post focusing on diplomacy. So first of all, your conversation with Professor Li is very inspiring. And just during your conversations about China-US, I think China's foreign ministry just announced that there will be a recent talk between China and US leader. So I want to ask a question about it. So from your opinion, you just said Biden's current move to meet Xi Jinping will be a dangerous move in their internal politics. So the question is, why? What do you think Washington and Beijing can get from such a meeting, since Biden will actually leave Washington in quite a month? Thank you.
Okay, 4 questions.
Okay, the first question is on assertiveness. And yes, I do think that the 2 words in the English language, aggressiveness and assertiveness, are 2 very different forms of behavior. So China has clearly become much more assertive, which is what all great powers are, but it hasn't become aggressive in the way that, as Graham Allison points out, in the early years when the United States became a great power, it declared war on Spain, conquered Philippines, and so on and so forth. So relatively speaking, certainly China remains assertive, but not aggressive. But that's based on data, on evidence. Now, on factionalism, by the way, in any political system, right, no matter which political system you have, you will always have political rivalries, you will have different groups, right? That's normal. But it's one thing to play by the rules of the game, whatever the rules are, and it's another to break the rules of the game. And I understand that Cho Yong-kang and Bo Xilai were trying to engineer some kind of coup d'etat against the established rules, right? That's very different. So in any political system, if you break the rules, you will get penalized. What's interesting is that in some ways, you could say that on January 6th, 2021, when Donald Trump refused to accept the results of the elections, when he encouraged the coup d'etat, that was also breaking the rules. So it's important from within political systems to create rules, and you have to abide by the rules. Because when people start breaking the rules, then the political system breaks down, regardless whether it's democratic or non-democratic. Every system has got its own set of rules. Now, your question, Daniel, on India, and I'm not sure I got the full thrust of it, but I have no question whatsoever that, let's say, if India becomes bigger than China, and India is about to overtake the United States, then I can guarantee you the number 1 power will always push down the number 2 power. And then once again, you might find United States and China collaborating as they did in the Cold War against the Soviet Union. And so, geopolitics is a very cold game. I mean, ideology doesn't matter, history doesn't matter. What matters is interests of power. But as of now, certainly, there's no question that India and the United States are getting closer to each other. Now, the 4th question, I'm not sure that I...
About the possible summit.
Oh, the summit. Oh, yeah, sorry. From the South China Morning Post. Well, I mean, in some ways, it'd be very, very difficult for President Joe Biden to deliver any long-term promises to President Xi's counterpart, because he's going to step down, Now, but despite that, if they want to meet, we should encourage it. Definitely encourage it, because every time leaders meet, especially leaders of competing powers, even if they can remove misunderstandings with each other, it'd be very, very useful. So, for example, the reason why relations between US and China stabilized in the second half of the Biden administration is because of the breakthrough meeting in Bali, And I met President Jokowi of Indonesia actually 1 or 2 days before that meeting, and I told President Jokowi, if you can arrange a good meeting between Joe Biden and Xi Jinping, the world will thank you. And he said to me, don't worry, Kishore, I've given them the nicest room in Bali for the meeting. And sure enough, by the way, they had a very good meeting, but unfortunately, a balloon came along. And the balloon destroyed it, as you know. But nonetheless, despite that, I'm a great believer in face-to-face meeting between leaders. And I would say, if they're going to meet again, I would certainly encourage the meeting. And by the way, they can meet in Laos, they can meet in Brazil, they can also meet in Peru at the APEC meeting. So there are 3 opportunities. Plus, frankly, if I was Joe Biden, I'd go to Beijing.
Okay. Well, I really hate to do that because the time is up. I know there's a lot of questions. I apologize. We cannot, do that because of some other obligation. But I wanted the audience to join me in thanking you, Kishore, for that very inspiring, extremely comprehensive, responses to some of the most critical issues at the philosophical, strategic, practical, economic, social, political levels. And also, I should say that you not only grace us for the CCCW and advise us, but most importantly, inspire us to serve as bridge. Despite your strong critique of the West, I think the West, especially the United States, should be graceful to you because your role is to wake up some people to have an unrealistic view, either overstate or most likely underestimate China's strength. I think it's a great service, not only to your country, Singapore, not only to ASEAN country, to Asia region, but it's really to the whole world. I think people in the West will gradually appreciate your important role as a bridge. And please join me in thanking again for that very, very important. I have a small token. For you. This is our lucky animal. It's a lion. It's the long ship. It's the bridge road. Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you.